No, that's just how things turned out. You know, at first they wrote and I didn't, but then I started to write. Most people remember George Harrison as the quiet Beatle who was gentle, spiritual, and not the kind of person you would expect to harbor a grudge. He was there with Lennon, McCartney, and Starr when they made songs that would last forever, such Yesterday, Let It Be, and Hey Jude. But one of those comrades brought him down to his lowest point, shaming him, betraying him, and leaving scars that he carried until he died. When George finally told the truth at 58, it changed all we thought we knew about him. But before we tell you who Harrison despised the most, we need to go back to his early days with the Beatles to understand why this betrayal hurt so much more than anyone thought it would. The childhood that made a Beatle. Before the world knew George Harrison as the quiet Beatle, he was just a little child living in a modest house with 2 floors and 2 rooms at 12 Arnold Grove. George was born on February 25, 1943. He lived in a house that was so chilly that even inside, you could feel your breath drift through the air in the winter. The toilet was outside in the yard, and the walls seemed to let in more cold air than warmth. But there was a woman inside that modest house who recognized something peculiar about her youngest child, Louise Harrison. Neighbors liked to joke that Louise's loud singing rocked the windows and that she had a strange habit while she was pregnant. Every Sunday, she listened to Radio India, letting the soothing sound of sittars and tablas fill the room. She thought such sounds may calm the baby that was growing inside her. George said years later that those sounds still echoed in his bones. That one aspect alone made it feel like fate was whispering. George liked to sketch guitars in the margins of his school books, but he felt like he was in prison. No guitars, no space for him. In 1956, one afternoon, everything changed. He heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting from a window in a house as he rode his bike. He quit writing. He subsequently remarked the moment felt like an explosion. Elvis sounded like a door opening in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. When he was 14, he begged his mom for a guitar. She paid £310 for one, which was a lot of money for them. And George practiced so much that his fingertips bled. He started his first band, the Rebels, after hearing Lonnie Donegan's skiffle songs. It was messy. It was quite noisy. It was theirs. Then fate stepped in again. George met a boy named Paul McCartney on the bus to school. 2 kids who ride the same bus and are both obsessed with guitars. Later, Paul would call George his little brother. They were merely youngsters back then, bending over the chairs, teaching each other chords, and dreaming about stages they had never seen. Paul took George to try out for John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in March 1958. Lennon thought he was too young. He said, "He looks 12. But George played the lead to Ranchi on a bus in the dark, with only a street lamp outside lighting the way. Lennon's silence after that said all George was going through. So there were just 3 boys from Liverpool with cheap guitars and aspirations that were too big to come true. They had no idea that ego, anger, envy, and treachery would one day convert their friendship into a war that would leave them with scars for life. John Lennon hurt George the most. At the height of the Beatles' glory, George Harrison's relationship with the band, notably with John Lennon, began to silently fall apart. From the outside, they looked like 4 brothers who couldn't be separated. But inside Abbey Road Studio 2, George felt more and more like the odd one out. And John, the man he used to look up to, was the one who hurt him the most. The tension started to build slowly in the middle of the 1960s, when George started writing songs he believed in. He took If I Needed Someone into the studio with a lot of confidence, but John barely looked at it and stated, "It's nothing." It wasn't feedback. It was a dismissal. George went home that night without saying a word to Pattie Boyd. John didn't even hear the music. From then on, it felt like John pulled away every time George matured. It was as if Lennon couldn't bear how Harrison was changing. John made fun of George in front of everyone when he got really into meditation and Indian philosophy. "You and your gurus, it's just another trap." George didn't fight back, but Ringo reported afterward that George's face looked like someone had stabbed him in front of everyone. The genuine breaking point happened during the Let It Be sessions. In the Raw 2021 Get Back tape, George attempts to explain a guitar idea, but John doesn't pay attention at all. His eyes are blank, as if Harrison isn't even there. George eventually let it out after a few seconds of feeling like he was going to die. "I will play whatever you want, or I won't play at all." And when the Beatles ultimately broke up, the resentment that had been buried didn't go away. It went off. Lennon met George in a New York hotel in 1973 during his crazy Lost weekend. Everyone thought it would be a nice reunion. When John casually suggested that they play Madison Square Garden together, George lost it. He got up, his cheeks hot, and yelled, "Where were you when I needed you?" Then, without warning, he grabbed over, yanked John's spectacles off his face, and flung them on the floor. His lover, May Pang, subsequently stated, "John froze, completely paralyzed." John Lennon was really scared of George Harrison for the first time in his life. Harrison was the quiet man who had finally let out everything he had kept inside for the 10 long years he had been a Beatle. The quiet, the contempt, and the hurt of being left by the person he loved most. Paul McCartney was the one George Harrison secretly hated to the end of his life. People frequently talk about how George and John didn't get along, but this is the fact that still surprises die-hard Beatles fans. George's friendship with Paul McCartney was the one that bothered him the most for the longest time. George and Paul's fight was quieter, colder, and much more unpleasant than the explosive event with John in 1973. It started softly, almost without anyone noticing, in the late 1960s when Paul began to take more and more control over the band's sound. George would bring in tunes he had been working on for months, and Paul would change them right away. Jeff Emerick remembers times when Paul would stand over George's shoulder and tell him exactly how to play a part. He said that he micromanaged George into the ground. Emerick later said it was too much. In an interview in 1974, Harrison finally told the truth. He claimed, "Paul ruined me as a guitarist only once. Not ruined in a technical sense, but ruined in an emotional sense." Paul's relentless criticism, direction, and dismissal broke George's confidence from the inside out. The worst thing happened during the workshops for Maxwell's Silver Hammer. George didn't like the song. Everyone did, but Paul kept making them do it over and over. After days of filming, George whispered to Ringo, "Why are we doing this?" Paul heard him and said, "Because it's my song." George never forgot that cold tone, but the big change happened in January 1969. George informed Paul on the second day of Let It Be that he didn't enjoy how Paul was telling him what to play on guitar. Paul said, "I'm trying to help you, George." George said something that Beatles historians feel was the most honest thing in the whole movie. "You don't pay attention to what other people say." George said the line to show how he felt next to Lennon and McCartney. The anger never really went away, even after many years. Someone asked Harrison in 1987 if he would ever play in a band with Paul again. He answered right away, "I'd play in a band with John, but not with Paul. It's not personal, it's just music." But everyone knew it was about them. Paul never really grasped the wound that George Harrison carried with him to the end of his life. A wound made by the pain of a friendship that could never find its balance. The last days, death, and the legacy that even his closest friends were shocked by. Long before people knew anything was wrong, George Harrison's last chapter began. By the end of the 1990s, he had previously fought throat cancer, lung cancer, and finally a brain tumor that made him feeble but determined to keep doing art. He kept working on the songs that would become brainwashed even when he was getting radiation therapy. Later, Donnie remembered going into the room and finding his dad whispering songs into a recorder since his voice was too feeble to carry. The urgency in those silent recordings said it all. He was running out of time. In the last few weeks of his life, the pain got worse and the doctor's face became more serious. Before anyone said anything, George knew what was going on. He wanted to go to Los Angeles and stay in a private property owned by Gavin de Becker, where he could spend his last days with Olivia and Donnie. There were gentle lights, flowers, and the sound of devout chanting that had been with him since 1966. It wasn't for show. It helped him stay calm throughout the worst suffering. As November 2001 came to an end, George had a tougher time talking. Visitors came in small groups. Messages were sent by Ravi Shankar. Tom Petty cried when he was on the phone. Paul McCartney even came by to say farewell. The meeting was awkward, emotional, and weirdly sweet. George became quieter on November 29, 2001, while Olivia and Donnie were with him. His breathing got slower, and his eyes got softer. His family read prayers from the Bhagavad Gita, the same words he had lived by for decades, in those last hours. He whispered one last thing to those who were closest to him, and then his body gave out. Even many who work in the sector were shocked by what happened next. His ashes were sent to India and scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers during a private ceremony that was planned with great care. It was the goodbye George had always wanted, spiritual, straightforward, and deeply connected to the principles that created his music. But every year, his legacy gets greater. The sun comes out here. All things must pass, including my instrument. The concert for Bangladesh and his 2 inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. These accomplishments made the quiet Beatle one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. Artists still talk about him the same way his son does. He followed his own way, even when it hurt. George Harrison held on to that pain longer than anyone else knew. And now you know the narrative he never told anyone. But what do you think? Could you have forgiven the person who harmed you the most? If you were in his shoes, please share your opinions in the space below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and switch on notifications so you can get more stories the history books never had the guts to.